Philip Spencer, who is a great colleague and a mentor to me and to others, and who wrote one of the most astonishing books about contemporary anti-Semitism with Robert Fine, which is on sale at the back, unless they have all been bought. Philip Spencer was very keen to be allowed to introduce Karin Stögner. And he wanted to, and he's poorly. He's all right, he's got some horrible bug, and he could not come. So he has sent me a text. So you are not listening to even more of me, you are listening to Philip Spencer. It is a great pleasure and indeed privilege to introduce Karin Stögner this afternoon. This is primarily, of course, because she is an outstanding scholar. She is the Professor of Sociology at the University of Passau in Germany and the author of many vital works, especially but not only on anti-Semitism. We are indeed going to publish one of her books next year in the series we produce with Routledge, some of whose titles also you can see at the back. We first met maybe 20 years ago or so when she joined the research network in the European Sociological Association, the very first of its kind, which Robert Fine played such a key role in setting up and had to overcome quite a lot of anti-Semitism in the process. Robert and Karin had many deep discussions over the years before he sadly died, and I know that they both learnt a lot from each other. He would have been so pleased that she has come here to deliver this lecture in his memory. He could see, as all of us in the network could also, how careful, rigorous, and serious her work on anti-Semitism is, grounded in the framework of real critical theory, showing how anti-Semitism as an ideology works in contemporary society to obscure and turn upside down the reality it purports to describe, and how so many of the ills of contemporary society get so easily and disgracefully projected onto Jews. As a critical theorist, she has shown not just how so many have betrayed the values they purport to believe in, but how feminism in particular is a vital resource for understanding contemporary anti-Semitism. This has taken a lot of courage, and Karin is not just a brilliant scholar, but a very principled and honourable one. She has for many years done much to counter the ignorance, stupidity, and downright malice that has undermined so many institutions of higher education here and abroad and made them shamefully so often quite unsafe places to work. As we seek to build our centre and fight back against all this, it is great for us to have you here today. So please join me in welcoming Karin to give this year's Robert Fine Memorial Lecture. And if I may, just one word from me too. People know that it was a long journey for me to become professor. And Karin also had a long journey and became a professor in Germany many, many years after she ought to have been recognized in that way. Karin, thank you for coming.
Thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much, David. Thank you very much, Philip, for these moving words. I'm really overwhelmed with the honor of being here and giving this lecture, Robert Fine Memorial Lecture, this year. I met Robert almost 2 decades ago, as Philip already said, when I discovered the research network on anti-Semitism and racism. And this is a group of scholars that has since become my academic home. And I miss Robert as a friend, and he was a mentor to me and to many of us, and particularly in the field of anti-Semitism critique. Especially after October 7, we desperately need the theoretical and political clarity, but also the prudence he embodied. So thank you very much for inviting me. Thank you very much for being here. Yeah, I'm really honored to giving this lecture. But delivering this year's Robert Fine lecture is also a special challenge. We look back on a year of rising anti-Semitism around the world. We were dismayed to see how the terror of Hamas and Palestinian jihad, Islamic jihad, including the sexual violence, was framed as legitimate resistance in considerable parts of the left and of intersectional and queer feminism. And as a feminist, I'm still shocked by this. Many of these discourses are trapped in a simplistic Manichaean worldview that divides the world into good and evil and identifies Israel with all that is despicable in Western modernity. Perhaps more than ever, we are confronted with the hatred of Israel as a new manifestation of anti-Semitism, one that differs considerably from other forms of racism. More than a decade ago, Robert Fine and Glenn Cousin were explicit about what characterized this new form of anti-Semitism. Let me quote: "Israel is depicted as a uniquely illegitimate state, Zionism as a uniquely noxious ideology, supporters of Israel as a uniquely powerful lobby, and memory of Israel, memory of the Holocaust, as a uniquely self-serving reference to the past," end of quote. This characterization applies perfectly to the current situation. So in my talk today, which is entitled Anti-Semitism and Sexism After 7 October, the Intersectionality of Ideologies. In this talk, I want to elaborate on how anti-Semitism and sexism intersect, permeate, and reinforce each other in the hatred of Israel, especially after 7 October. I will firstly address the problem of anti-Semitism hardly being recognized within the intersectionality framework, as I think that this is one of the major reasons for Western feminists blinding out anti-Semitism in their reactions to 7 October massacres. And I will refer to these reactions in the second point of my lecture. And in the third and final point, I will present an intersectional critique of anti-Semitism, focusing on how anti-Semitism and sexism intersect in the Islamist ideology of Hamas. So let me start with my first point. Many years ago, I started to view the complex interplay between anti-Semitism and sexism as a form of intersectionality. And I often discussed this with Robert, and he wasn't so very sure about that, because he was critical of intersectionality, because intersectionality left out anti-Semitism or was even open to anti-Semitism. But I wanted to reclaim the intersectionality frame for a critique of anti-Semitism intertwining with sexism, racism, and nationalism. And so I proposed the term of the intersectionality of ideologies. This implied a new focus on intersectionality as a tool for criticizing the multidimensional power relations, namely to abandon identity politics and instead focus on the ideological dimension of domination. This is because I think that identity politics merely illuminates the subjective side of power relations based on exclusion, oppression, and inequality, the side of lived experience. And I'm sure, and I think that lived experience is important and an important side in all that, but it does not explain the economic, political, social, and historical process of excluding whole groups of people, be it women, Jews, or those marginalized on racial grounds. And one reason for this is that the motive for oppression has nothing to do with the experiences of the oppressed, but with the structures of society in which oppression takes place. So while identity politics gives a voice to the marginalized, it also tends to isolate individual victim groups from each other. And because all this takes place in a society characterized by the capitalism mechanism of competition, identity politics all too often leads to victim competition. The ideologies that legitimize oppression, exclusion, and exploitation further divide those affected by them. Everything would be easy if the intersection of ideologies also led to solidarity between victim groups, as intersectionality promises. As a woman, intersectionality says you cannot close your eyes to the oppression of other groups simply because women are not a homogeneous collective but have different, even conflicting, socioeconomic interests and different identity orientations. Recognizing difference is thus a prerequisite for solidarity. But anti-Semitism has consistently been a notable gap in the concept of intersectionality since the 1970s. It was not only overlooked analytically, receiving little attention within the triad of race, class, and gender, but it was also excluded from identity politics. Anti-Semitism was often dismissed as a prejudice between white people, and the Shoah even being viewed as a white-on-white crime, and thus not part of the problem that intersectionality copes with. The reason for this is that intersectionality originally focuses on racism that divides society along the color line. That does not mean that there aren't any other forms of racism, but these are seldomly recognized in intersectionality. Anti-Semitism is not a mere form of racism, but an ideology of its own kind that intersects with racism. The difference can be put briefly. While racism legitimizes the over-exploitation or surplus exploitation of racialized people beyond bourgeois contractual relations, anti-Semitism, on the other hand, is not about exploitation of Jews, but about blaming Jews for all the evils of capitalism and modernity. Anti-Semitism projects the injustices of capitalist society onto the Jews. They would be the masterminds behind the exploitation of racialized people and would profit from it. Thus, anti-Semitism can even be viewed as an outcry of the oppressed. The original intersectionality frame follows this characteristic of anti-Semitism when it excludes Jews. Intersectionality explains why and how people are pushed to a position of inferiority and how this affects their lives. Jews, however, are not seen as inferior, but as superior, and as an elite, so they are not part of intersectionality frame. So the reason why Jews are denied solidarity in many intersectional approaches lie in anti-Semitism itself, and this is clear from the reactions to the horrors of 7 October by a lot of Western feminists. This brings me to the second point of my lecture, namely feminist reactions to the 7 October massacres. Immediately after 7 October, many feminists demanded in statements and open letters to contextualize the Hamas massacres, and in doing so ignored anti-Semitism as an essential ideological driver of Hamas. Instead, they delegitimized Israel as settler colonialism, accused Israel of genocide, and called for boycott of Israeli scientists, academics, and artists. Hardly any letter openly mourned the Israeli victims or demanded that all hostages be released unconditionally. In the face of the lack of grief and solidarity for Israeli victims, the Austrian writer Doron Rabinovich spoke of, I quote, a process of derealization. What happened to the victims is not recognized. This is a second erasure of their existence, end of quote. According to Theodor Adorno, derealization and victim-perpetrator reversal were characteristic of post-Shoah antisemitism, an antisemitism that sought to defend itself against the guilt of National Socialism. After 10/7, various forms of derealization took place, from silence to denial to outright legitimation of massacres. Feminists are widely represented in these strategies. To mention just the most prominent example, Judith Butler, whose prominence and influence in international feminist and queer communities can hardly be overvalued. Speaking in Paris in March 2024, Butler legitimized the Hamas terror as an act of resistance while openly denying its anti-Semitic character. I quote, a fantasy of Jewish suffering, unquote, would obscure the history of power and violence in the Middle East. They said that, I quote, this was not a terrorist attack, it was not an anti-Semitic attack, it was an attack on Israelis, unquote. And with this, they declared both the Jewish identity of the majority of those attacked and the anti-Semitic ideology of Hamas to be irrelevant, rather than recognizing these moments as an essential context. And we see that contextualization, the term contextualization, has become a buzzword since then, and the framework within which anti-Semitism was consistently ignored, while in fact it increased on a global scale. Contextualization has even become a framework within anti-Semitism can be expressed openly today. Butler also doubted the rape of Israeli women by Hamas and demanded to see evidence, in stark contrast to the otherwise widely accepted feminist definitional power of rape victims. It is also an open and deliberate rejection of perception, because the Hamas rapes are among the most documented crimes in history. As early as 7 October, pictures of obviously raped women were circulated in online forums by the perpetrators themselves. But ignoring and actively blinding out anti-Semitism occurred well before 7 October and went hand in hand with legitimizations of radical Islamism. As early as 2006, in a discussion at the UC Berkeley, Butler described the Islamist terrorist organizations Hamas and Hezbollah as progressive social movements that should be recognized as part of the global left. Butler distanced themselves from the use of violence, but not from Hamas's political goal of erasing Israel as a Zionist state and of establishing an Islamist theocracy grounded on exterminatory anti-Zionism and on gender apartheid. Another pioneer of such an alliance between the left, feminism, and radical Islamism was Susan Buck-Morss. She's less famous and less prominent than Butler, but within the critical theory community, she is quite prominent. She is a feminist critical theorist hitherto renowned for her scholarly work on Walter Benjamin, on Hegel, and on universalism. In the aftermath of 9/11, she published a book entitled Thinking Past Terror, in whose preface we read, I quote, "The book's central proposal is that Islamism as a political discourse can be considered together with critical theory as a critique of modernity in its Western developed form," end of quote. So after 9/11, Buck-Morss saw the Western critique of modernity in crisis and hoped for support from Islamists, and thereby positively referred to Sayyid Qutb, one of the masterminds of the Muslim Brotherhood, whose rejection of Western modernity was explicitly anti-Semitic and misogynist. In his 1950 propaganda text entitled Our Struggle with the Jews, Qutb created crude anti-Semitic conspiracy myths about Jews doing evil and about Allah sending Hitler and the Muslims to save the world from the Jews. He accused the Jews of being behind all those things he abhorred. Let me quote just one passage from that book. Behind the doctrine of atheistic materialism was a Jew. Behind the doctrine of animalistic sexuality was a Jew. And behind the destruction of the family and the shattering of sacred relationships in society was a Jew. End of quote. So this quote, I think, highlights the strong connection between anti-Semitism, anti-feminism, and the opposition to sexual self-determination that is so prominent in Islamism, but also in far-right extremism. Now the question is how and why a declared feminist and critical theorist like Susan Buck-Morss can build an argument on Sayyid Qutb. Precondition is, of course, the blinding out of anti-Semitism. And indeed, Buck-Morss fails to mention Qutb's and the Muslim Brotherhood's anti-Semitism throughout the whole book. But the left feminist Islamist alliance proposed by Buck-Morss and Butler requires not only ignoring anti-Semitism, but also dismissing anti-feminism. This is achieved through a form of cultural relativism that frames women's autonomy in post-colonial contexts as resistance to so-called West toxification. In this view, women's freedom is interpreted as liberation from Western dominance rather than from tribal, cultural, or religious systems of patriarchal oppression. Buck-Morss demands explicitly the recognition of non-Western patriarchal gender relations, since they are viewed in her perspective as a critique of Western commodification of female bodies. Similarly, Butler viewed the Islamic burqa as, I quote, an exercise in modesty and pride, end of quote. This is from Precarious Life. It is indeed disturbing to see how feminists in an anti-Western rage legitimize an Islamism that is anti-Semitic, anti-emancipatory, anti-feminist, misogynist, and homophobic. What has happened to this kind of feminism that something like that could happen? How can anti-Semitism, misogyny, and homophobia be legitimized as an act of resistance? Why is the West conceived of only in terms of repression and not also in terms of emancipation? The answer is that the concept of emancipation itself is sometimes viewed as repressive. One reason for this is the development of a cultural relativism that emerged in the aftermath of a critique of the universal concepts of enlightenment. Already Horkheimer and Adorno criticized that the universal was repressive against the particular. But their intention was not to discard the idea of the universal altogether, but instead to find ways of thinking the universal in mediation with the particular, and thus to deprive the universal, but also the particular, of their respective repressive characters. Adorno's critique was a rescuing critique of the universal, aiming at enabling solidarity across narrow boundaries. In most strands of intersectional feminism, by contrast, the idea of the universal has been dismissed altogether and as only repressive, and instead particulars were strengthened up to mere particularism. As a result, women's universal interest in liberation from patriarchal domination was fragmented. The demand for women's emancipation in the global South is no longer directed against patriarchal and sexist structures within communities and societies in the global South, but against the influence of Western liberal concepts, and this influence is called West toxification. In this perspective, also the demand for equal rights and sexual self-determination may be considered toxic if it contradicts cultural or religious norms. Women disappear as autonomous subjects behind the hegemony of patriarchal religion and culture. Intersectional feminism has ultimately lost its unifying goal of liberating women and non-normative sexualities from patriarchal oppression on a global scale. Its new goal is the recognition of culture and religion. That is why women in Iran, for example, who are fighting for their freedom and for a Western lifestyle, find comparatively little solidarity in the West. Here it becomes clear what has happened. Intersectionality rightly emphasized that women were oppressed not only due to gender, but also due to race and class. Intersectionality wanted to analyze the mutual entanglement of these categories. However, during the broad political struggle of which intersectionality was part, it was partly hijacked by anti-feminist reactionary powers, so that gender eventually lost out to religion and culture. Instead of liberating women, intersectionality is now often used to keep women in the place that religion or culture assigns to them. But what does this have to do with anti-Semitism? Why are cultural relativist feminists often prone to anti-Semitism? It is because Jews and Israel are seen as representative of the very universalism identified with the West and with Western domination. In today's cultural relativist theories, the universal has become a sign of white supremacy, responsible for racism. Overcoming racism is thus linked to ending universalism. The loss of feminist consciousness in cultural relativism creates an opening for anti-Semitism as an outlet. The common goal has been replaced by a common foe, Israel and the West in general, which now fill the ideological void left by the erosion of feminist solidarity. This is exactly what we have seen after 7 October. The anti-Semitism and anti-feminism of Hamas is denied or even legitimized as part of a legitimate resistance against an alleged colonial power and against Western imperialism. The ideological delusion goes so far as to claim that once Israel is destroyed, all other problems will be solved, from sexism to homophobia, even to the climate crisis. Palestine will set us free. This is the motto of a political theology that expresses the desire for salvation in a post-factual age in which all the evil in the world is projected onto Israel. In this completely delusional worldview, world peace depends on the solution of the Israel question, which is a new variant of the old Jewish question. I often discuss this with Robert. In the Jewish question, he once said, Jews can personify whatever is wrong, be it the undesired particular, the false universal that is sometimes equated with cosmopolitanism, or even universalism itself when it is deemed tyrannical and repressive of the particular. With this, I come to the third and last point of my lecture, an intersectional critique of anti-Semitism and sexism. The German socio-psychologist Rolf Pohl pointed to the threefold hatred that can be depicted as motivational force in Hamas's massacre. The victims were Israeli, this is hatred of the state of Israel. They were Jewish, which is anti-Semitism, and they were women, which is misogyny. So addressing the specificity of Hamas's anti-Semitism requires us to see it as an intersectional ideology, and thus to critically reflect on its intersection with sexism, anti-feminism, and homophobia. The early critical theorists of Frankfurt School, particularly Else Frenkel-Brunswick, Theodor Adorno, and Max Horkheimer, can be very helpful in this multi-layered analysis. For them, anti-Semitism was the central ideology of modernity, encapsulating a whole worldview that projected all that is deemed evil in modernity onto the Jews. They pointed to the particularly ambiguous character of modern anti-Semitism, which supposes that Jews would possess immense power and that they would secretly rule the world. In this conspiracy myth, anti-Semites see themselves as inferior to the Jews. At the same time, however, anti-Semitism also portrays Jews as weak. And this is the point where it overlaps with anti-feminism. In the dialectic of enlightenment, Horkheimer and Adorno's seminal book on the critique of modern domination, we read about the affinities between the hatred of women and the hatred of Jews. The hatred of women, seen as weaker and marked by subjugation, they write, stems from the same source as the hatred of Jews. Both women and Jews visibly represent groups that have not held power for thousands of years. So a common feature of anti-Semitism and sexism is that in feudal Europe, as well as in the pre-modern Islamic world, both women and Jews had no right to bear arms to defend themselves. They depended on the protection of Christian and Islamic rulers. At the same time, the prescribed inferiority of women and Jews was reinterpreted in conspiracy myths. For example, the Jews were behind the plague and that women were sorceresses who bewitched men with their unrestrained sexuality. In modern times, the anti-Semitic myth of the Jewish world conspiracy has become prominent. Contemporary Islamism and right-wing extremism see feminism and women's emancipation, the so-called gender ideology, as being orchestrated by Zionism or world Jewry to ruin culture, religion, and nations. That according to Horkheimer and Adorno, anti-Semitism and anti-feminism are motivated by the prescribed weakness of Jews and women deserves another thought against the background of October 7 massacres. The desire to see Israel and Israelis, and Israeli women in particular, as weak and defenseless is evident today in much of the West's anti-Western support for Hamas. Israeli women as soldiers are seen as a specific narcissistic insult to masculinists. Seeing them defeated by the Hamas is what made Islamists around the world so happy after 7 October. Take, for example, Joseph Mossad, a Columbia University professor and legitimizer of Hamas terror. He wrote on 8 October, I quote, "The resistance has effectively obliterated the myth of Israeli military might and the undeserved reputation of its intelligence apparatus," end of quote. So anti-Semites and sexists want to see Jews and women defenseless, which is another reason why the state of Israel so infuriates them. But there are more connections between anti-Semitism and sexism than proscribed weakness and conspiracy. In the studies in the authoritarian personality carried out by Adorno and Else Frenkel-Brunswick in the 1940s in the USA, the strictly binary gender relations and the related images of pure femininity and ideal masculinity turned out to be crucial moments also in anti-Semitism. There was a significant correlation between the insistence on a strict gender binary on the one hand and other markers of authoritarianism, such as ethnocentric, nationalistic, and anti-Semitic attitudes on the other hand. The strict separation of male and female and the intolerance of moments of the other gender in one's own gender is a model for the very identitarian and stereotypical thinking that anti-Semitism also follows. It is therefore not surprising that anti-Semitism contains elements of a heterosexist, homophobic, and transphobic ideology, but turned upside down, as evidenced in the anti-Semitic figure of the effeminate Jew, who would destabilize the well-established binary gender order. Throughout the long history of anti-Semitism, Jews were imagined and feared as gender benders, who were not clearly assignable to neither male nor female, but who were placed outside the binary order and viewed as the total other. Jews would undermine non-Jewish culture through their deviant gender order. Thus, heterosexism is a major ideological component of anti-Semitism, not only in Europe and the West, but also in the Middle East. This is evident when the spiritual leader of the Islamic Republic of Iran, Ali Khamenei, regularly blames Zionism and Israel as degenerate and of destabilizing the holy Islamic gender order. Hence, one of the most important discoveries of the studies in the authoritarian personality was that ideologies such as anti-Semitism, sexism, nationalism, homophobia, ethnocentrism, and the legitimation of class inequality rarely occur as isolated phenomena, but they develop within a broader ideological framework, and this broader ideological framework was termed the authoritarian ideological syndrome. Ideologies are thus certainly intersectional. They permeate and reinforce each other. Anti-Semitism appears as a master ideology in the sense that it entails a whole worldview that operates with moments that are sexist, homophobic, transphobic, nationalistic, or also post-nationalistic, and which entail a personification of capitalist exploitation in the Jews. Thus, anti-Semitism takes on and renews its specificity through the flexible interplay with other ideologies. And this is why anti-Semitism is an intersectional ideology. In a last step, I want to elaborate a little on the ideological background of this intersection between anti-Semitism and sexism in Islamism. Already before modernization, Islam had associated Jews with all sorts of supposedly evil behavior: envy, treachery, greed, cowardice, materialism, but also with preferring life in this world to life after death. With the decline of the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century, also Islamic anti-Semitism began to identify Jews with those transformations of modernity that were rejected: abstract law, urbanization, emancipation, and the weakening of the patriarchal gender order. In contemporary Islamism, Israel and Zionism stand for individualism, secularism, the emancipation of women, and the demand for sexual self-determination, all of which are modern developments within the Islamic world that are opposed as un-Islamic and as the result of a westernization that must be undone. Anti-Semitism, exterminatory anti-Zionism, and a regime of gender apartheid form the pillars of Islamist fundamentalist ideology. Its gender regime includes a repressive culture of honor and shame, which radically subordinates women and suppresses homosexuality. This oppressive gender system serves as a stabilizing function in Islamic communities, and these communities never fully embraced the Enlightenment idea of the autonomous individual who internalized cultural norms to repress instincts. Rather, as Bassam Tibi argued, the Islamic world's engagement with modernity has been fragmented, leading to significant consequences for the development of subjectivity. While modern scientific and technological advancements were embraced, the cultural, political, and social dimensions of modernity were rejected, such as gender equality, individual autonomy, critical thinking, and sexual self-determination. As a result, technological progress failed to transform individuals into modern reflective subjects capable of navigating complexity and ambiguity. Instead of fostering personal agency, curiosity, and independent reasoning, the incomplete embrace of modernity led to a widespread weakening of subjectivity or even to authoritarian desubjectivization. Bassam Tibi called this the half-modernity in the Islamic world. His diagnosis, however, corresponds to the insights of the studies in authoritarianism carried out by the critical theorists of the Frankfurt School 50 years before that. This parallel implies that what Tibi called half-modernity is not unique for the Islamic world. In Western societies as well, The process of autonomous subjectivation was a precarious balancing act between aspiration and reality within a hierarchical society. All too often, this process failed, as evidenced by the emergence of the authoritarian syndrome in Europe and in the USA. The failure to fully adopt modernity has prevented the development of subjects who can balance the ambivalences of a modern world. True subjectivity requires the ability to mediate critically between personal autonomy and external pressures. Without the cultural, social, and political framework to support this kind of inner development of an autonomous subject, individuals in many Islamic but also other authoritarian contexts remain unable to process the disruptive and often disorienting changes brought about by modernity. Instead of cultivating the capacity to tolerate ambiguity and conflict, individuals are left unprepared and exposed to these changes, resulting in feelings of instability, disconnection, and anomie. This comes close to what Freud called the discomfort in culture, a malaise that is deepening today in a nihilistic, post-factual age of total relativism. And this makes, I think, the focus on subjectivity so important. If subjectivation fails and individuals are unable to internalize rules or develop self-regulation, they are also not able to develop a critical relationship to external authorities. Instead, they rely on external authorities for direction. This is why the repressive gender order is ever more harshly enforced, the more subjectivation and internalization fails. The repressive gender order provides stability in an unstable world. Since the renunciation and sublimation of the drives is not rationally comprehended in the sense of an autonomous decision, anger arises, which is directed at the denied object, in this case the woman, instead of the denying authority, in this case the patriarchal order. Projective envy is a strong motivation for anti-Semitism and anti-feminism. Jews and women were kept out of the spheres of power for centuries in the harem or in the ghetto. This fact is turned upside down in the cliché that they did not have to renounce the satisfaction of their drives. Thus, anti-Semitism and sexism are very much about unlived life being projected on Jews and on women. In this half-modernity, the renunciation from sexual satisfaction is transformed into the subject's idiosyncratic abhorrence of anything that reminds them of unrestrained sexuality, seen as disgusting and inferior. And this disqualification extends to those who are associated with lust, decadence, and an un-Islamic way of life. Coming back to Else Frenkel-Brunswick, she has analyzed in the Authoritarian personality that the fusion of repressed sexuality, radical masculinity, and worship, nihilistic worship of death, is a central socio-psychological pattern of authoritarianism that links sexism, anti-feminism, homophobia, and transphobia with anti-Semitism. Sexist anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic misogyny equally allow acting out repressed sexual desires in a sadistic manner. The ambivalent hatred of self-determined sexual joy is manifest in the murder of Jews and the murder of emancipated women, since both stand for these hated ideals of individual joy and happiness. In anti-Semitism and sexism, the desire for freedom and emancipation itself is eradicated, and it was thus no coincidence that Hamas attacked a music festival where young, left, secular, and emancipated Israelis were celebrating. They were celebrating life. They stand for modern life, freedom, equality, and free sexuality, and the Islamists hate all that. Let me conclude. My German colleague Samuel Salzborn once gave a clear definition of anti-Semitism as the inability to feel concretely and to think abstractly. That emotions become more and more abstract can be seen in the passion and in the excitement on the part of those who protest against Israel today. I dare say that this passion replaces the feeling for oneself, for one's own body, whose limits and ambivalences are intolerable. The boundaries of the body shall be undone, which may lead to a nihilistic cult of death that many queer and feminist supporters of Hamas share with the Hamas terrorists. The negative identification with Israel as an alleged Frankenstein state manifests a distorted desire for authenticity in a world experienced as utterly alienated and isolated. From this point of view, the critique of anti-Semitism entails a critique of society as a whole. This is what Robert has done explicitly and precisely in all his work. But what does this mean for us as feminists and critics of anti-Semitism? Firstly, we need a feminist critique of anti-Semitism and a feminism that is critical of anti-Semitism. In other words, we need an intersectional critique of anti-Semitism. This means, secondly, that we should reclaim intersectionality, starting from the critical theory and the studies in the authoritarian personality that critically recognize the intrinsic connections between anti-Semitism and sexism, homophobia and transphobia. Thirdly, we should maintain and critically realize the promise of intersectionality to provide us with a framework for comprehensive solidarity and insight into multi-layered systems of domination. This demands the radical critique of cultural relativism. And fourthly, the criticism of feminism that I gave here was meant to be a rescuing feminist critique. We should criticize anti-Semitism among feminists, queer and trans people, but not turn against feminism, queer or trans people altogether. The feminist, queer, and trans cause is still important for me. Thank you very much for your attention and patience.